Okay, thank you so much.
Muy
Just
bien,
while we're
muchísimas
waiting for the
gracias. Mientras
slides to
esperamos
come
a
up. Oh, here we are.
que salgan
Look
las
how
diapositivas,
nice.
aquí está, perfecto.
Wonderful. I really want to thank
Quiero dar las
organizer. What a
gracias
wonderful
a los
celebration.
organizadores por esta
40
fantástica
years of one
celebración,
organization.
40 años,
It's a pleasure for
y
me
es
to
realmente
be
un
here
placer poder estar hoy aquí
and to celebrate with
y
everyone.
celebrar y celebrarlo con todos vosotros.
Also, I am
Y
able to
además,
talk about my favorite
voy a poder hablar
subject,
de
which is the importance of
que es la
hearing from both
importancia
ears during important times in development. So all of this work is really a team effort. Research, clinical work, you know that we need a team
trabajo de investigación en
to treat
clínica.
children with hearing
Necesitamos
loss.
un equipo
And in the
para
hospital for
tratar a
sick
los
children, we
niños
have
con,
a wonderful team made up of
con
clinical
deficiencia
people
auditiva. Y
and researchers, and we
tenemos
all work
muchos
together in the same hallway.
Muchas personas,
So you
muchos
can see
colaboradores,
the
todos
hallway
trabajamos en el
here.
mismo pasillo, podemos ver el pasillo
Here
aquí.
the clinicians are, and
Y aquí
here's the
tenemos
laboratory.
aquí tenemos la
You
parte
may
clínica
know
y aquí
some
tenemos
of the
laboratorio
clinicians,
y
Dr.
conocéis
Blake
algunos
Papson, Dr.
de
Sharon
los
Cushing, and
médicos,
all of
por
the
ejemplo,
students.
y
I want to
todos los
acknowledge
estudiantes que
their
también
time
quiero
and effort in
reconocer
putting
el
together
esfuerzo
this
y el
work.
tiempo que le dedican a
Now,
hacer ese trabajo
it's
posible.
just after lunch, so you may be feeling a little bit tired. So I want to tell you what the main points are of this talk. This slide will actually be the last slide, so if you fall asleep in the middle, it's okay, you'll know what I said. Okay? First, I want to tell you that it's challenging for children to hear with one cochlear implant. We've made remarkable progress for children with hearing loss, profound hearing loss with a cochlear implant, but there are remaining challenges, and we have to be realistic about what those are. Second, we can actually help children to reduce those challenges if we give them hearing in both ears. Second, third, if we're going to get the best benefit from bilateral hearing, we have to be conscious of the time that we provide hearing to both ears in early development. Because if we leave hearing asymmetric with one better ear than another, the auditory system will reorganize to prefer the better hearing ear. And when this occurs in development, it's very hard to reverse. Not completely impossible, but difficult. So we would like to avoid that. And finally, I'll tell you that even though we have gained huge benefits with bilateral devices, providing bilateral hearing, we have not solved the problem completely in children. There's still work to be done to help them gain true binaural hearing. So let's first talk about the first point. Why is it challenging for children to listen through one cochlear implant? And I think some of this comes when we realize that children are not just in our sound booths. They need to listen outside in the real world, and listening for children can be very complex. For example, see on the video to the left how dynamic lives of children are relative to when we put them in the sound booth. Look at these children playing together. They rarely look at each other. There's a lot of movement. They're still playing. This one is running around. They're still communicating about their game. And he'll run back. These two are playing together. These two, they don't look at each other, but they'll glance at each other quickly here to say, are you still playing with me? Yes, you're still with me. Good. Now, this little girl here, she wants to play too. How does she get involved? She gives a quick glance and she gets involved and plays. All of the communication that's happening, they have to hear in all directions as they're focusing on the toys and moving around, and there are many, many different kinds of sounds that they're trying to listen to. More than one child at a time. And this is where we have to realize that we have all over the world children playing, and children with hearing loss need to listen in these difficult environments. So if we concentrate on this playground for children, often in research, that complex listening environment has been compared to an adult cocktail party. And I want you to think about some of the differences that are in the playground relative to the adult cocktail. Let's think about this as the child's cocktail party, because it's a very complex listening situation, but it's very different in a couple of ways. Firstly, it's more frequent. The playground is not just on a Saturday night. It's many times, many days, and this is where children are learning to interact, they're growing, this is their educational situation, and it's where their socialization occurs. Very important. Very dynamic, as I showed you in the video. We as adults like to stand in one place, even in a cocktail party, and face the speaker that we want to listen to. That is not the case, as you saw in the video, or in the playground. Children are moving all the time. Even the child with hearing loss, let's say in the middle, who wants to hear from all directions, she's also moving as well. And lastly, who is she wanting to hear in an adult cocktail party? Maybe we're concentrating on the people in front of us. Sometimes, we hear something behind us and we'll change and join a different conversation. But here, children are switching who they want to listen to very quickly, and there are many, many different targets. And this becomes a very difficult situation to listen to with one cochlear implant. How are we going to solve this problem? One of the things that we think will help is if we can provide children with binaural hearing so that they can hear in all directions in space. They can distinguish between these sounds by where they are in space. Now, we know that this is a common situation for children wearing cochlear implants because the devices now log the situations that children are in throughout their days. So if we look at our first 150 children who we gained this information from, what you can see is that the data logging tells us how often, in terms of hours per day, they're in quiet, they are listening to speech with other sounds, so speech and noise alone, or music. And you can see clearly that indeed, children are more often listening in speech and noise than any of the other situations. The other thing that's important to see here is that there's a change with age. So as the age of the child goes from infancy into school age, their time spent in speech and noise increases. That makes sense. But look here how it decreases as children become adolescents. Does that mean that high school is not noisy? No, but it means that adolescents are removing themselves from difficult situations listening. And you can see that here in quiet. So their time spent in quiet goes up and up into adolescence. And that's, we think, telling us about the challenges of listening in difficult situations for children with hearing loss. This was also found through a different study in Australia through parent questionnaires where they asked children with hearing aids, where does your child spend most of their time? And the answer, strangely, in Australia, was that they were inside. That I found funny coming from Canada. But they were mostly inside in a group with other children. This is the children with hearing loss, and this is the children with normal hearing peers. So they're no different from normal hearing peers, but in terms of being in this situation most, but you can see that the proportion of time spent by the children with hearing loss is actually reduced relative to normal. And where are they spending more time? In quiet, indoor, one-on-one situations, so that facilitates their listening. And that's a problem. Now, if we think about what children with unilateral cochlear implants can do with those implants in a very controlled, quiet sound booth, we see amazing results. They're variable, but these are adolescents using one device, repeating back monosyllabic words. It's a PBK test. And you can see on average, their accuracy is almost 80%. Excellent. There's some variability, definitely, but should we be content with this? I don't think so, and I'm going to show you why. If we ask children a more difficult listening task, we start to see some of the challenges that they have. So in this task, what we did is we asked children to listen to a sentence. We knew that they could repeat back all of the words of the sentence. That didn't matter. We presented the sentence with 4 different emotions, and we wanted them to tell us what emotion is being presented in the sentence. Angry, happy, fearful, or sad. So you can listen and see. This is one example.
Going out of the room now, and I'll be back later.
I'll do it again.
I'm going out of the room now, and I'll be back later.
So I hope you could hear the anger in the postdoc's voice, Talar Popian, very angry. And what she found was that children with normal hearing were able to do this better in the open bars than children using unilateral cochlear implants. They really struggled to do it. So we thought, well, that's okay. We will give them a way to compensate for this listening difficulty. We're going to show them the person speaking in a video. That should solve all the problems, right?
I'm going out of the room now, and I'll be back later.
So that we found helps children with cochlear implants. Definitely they have improved accuracy in identifying the emotion, but still it's not as good as normal. Why? They have the information visually, but it's because to combine those two, they're not completely integrating between the 2 different modes, vision and auditory. And it's inefficient to do that. And you can see that when you look at the reaction time. How long did it take these 2 different groups to make their decisions? And you can see in both the auditory only task, as well as when we gave the video with vision and hearing, that it took much longer for the children with cochlear implants to respond than their normal hearing peers. Even with vision, they're thinking about it more. That tells us about the effort that they have listening. We also did this in a slightly more simple task here, asking them what is the emotion now in music. And you only have 2 choices. Is the music happy or is it sad? And again, we found, although children with unilateral cochlear implants could do the task with fairly high accuracy, they were able to say, wow, yes, that's happy music or sad music. They still had more errors, so the accuracy was decreased relative to normal hearing peers. But the biggest problem was the time that it took to make the decision, almost double that of normal hearing peers. They're spending too much time thinking about what they're listening to and making a decision. And that's very strange in oral communication, spoken language, where it's a back and forth that goes very quickly. Now, we do a lot of work looking at the consequences of hearing development through cochlear implants on the brain. And so we looked at these adolescents using unilateral cochlear implants, and I'm going to explain the brain measures a little bit more later. But we compared the activity just in response to simple sounds. The children were doing nothing, just watching a movie, listening to these sounds, and we compared the activity in those children throughout the brain to normal hearing peers. And we found some remarkable differences in particular areas of the brain. Here, the left frontal cortex and the right precuneus, both of these areas are involved in attention. So this suggested to us, because there were differences here, that children with unilateral cochlear implants, although they grew up with these devices for most of their lives, they were able to acquire good speech perception, were using attentional areas differently than their peers, reflecting, we think, the challenges that they have listening. So let's go back to the auditory pathways and remember that when we give hearing devices, hearing aids or cochlear implants, we are not treating the ear. The problem in the ear remains. What we're trying to do is treat the auditory system, to give the auditory pathways and the auditory brain access to sound. So this is really what we're treating. And when we stimulate from one cochlear implant, we want the auditory pathways to carry that information from the auditory nerve through the brain stem and all the way up through the midbrain to thalamus to cortex. And I want you to see here that most of the pathways cross contralaterally, beginning in the brain stem, but there are ipsilateral projections to the brain as well. I want you to remember that. I also want you to remember that in the brain stem, there is some specialization of processing that begins with sound. So here, when neurons go into this area, they then proceed in a dorsal stream where information about the frequencies that are contained in the sound are being processed. So you can think of this as the auditory system trying to pull out, what is this sound? And this is a different stream than neurons which connect here more ventrally and then connect into the superior olivary complex where information from the two ears comes and is integrated in order to detect very important cues between the ears to tell us where sounds are coming from. So there are many groups looking at the what pathway. How do we get better frequency information to children with cochlear implants so they can hear those nuances in emotion and in music? But we thought, with one cochlear implant, you know what? We are completely ignoring the where pathway. There is no input going there, and thus children have no idea where sounds are coming from. Maybe the where pathway is a key to helping these children achieve better hearing. And this came from an understanding of that maybe it's very difficult simply to listen with one ear. If you think about this group of children playing, in this game, I don't know if you know it, the child who's blindfolded has to go to where the children are calling her. So imagine this game if you have one deaf ear. All of the sounds on this side are muted for that. She must rely basically on the differences between these children, their voices, and these children. She doesn't know where the sounds are coming from. She has to strategize just comparing between the ears, moving her head around, trying to figure it out. Very, very challenging because she has no access to the important binaural cues that exist in the where pathways. That's what the where pathways are there to do. They're there to detect differences in timing and level between the ears, which exist because when a sound is coming from one side, it is going to be arriving first at the near ear relative to the other ear, and it's going to be louder in the near ear. Those are really tiny differences that the auditory system, that where pathway, has to pick up. And if you have no input to the where pathways because of unilateral deafness, they are not available to you. So let's think about that second question. Could we help the challenge of listening with a unilateral cochlear implant by just giving access to hearing in both ears? So we did this just by putting two cochlear implants in. And we did this a long time ago, and we've been studying these children ever since because they're absolutely fascinating. And once we established the benefits, and I'm going to show you the benefits of having two cochlear implants, we started to realize there are children out there who have one deaf ear and good hearing in the other ear. They can hear acoustic sound in that ear, either through a hearing aid that amplifies sound or through a normal hearing ear. And they were not cochlear implant candidates. We were leaving them with unilateral loss, asymmetric hearing. So we decided to also implant these children. These become what we know as the bimodal users. I'm going to show you just a quick idea of some of the benefits of using bilateral cochlear implants and bimodal devices. Remember the task, do you hear this music as happy or sad? We did this again in groups of children who use bimodal devices or 2 cochlear implants. And what you can see here is we didn't help them achieve any better accuracy. We didn't. They did the task fairly well, as they had done with 1 cochlear implant, because we just weren't giving them any better access to frequency information important for listening to music. But look at the reaction times. They are now normalized. That tells us just for listening even to music with 2 ears makes it easier. So we knew we were on the right path. And I want you to understand how difficult it is to listen unilaterally, even when there's 1 normal hearing ear. We are studying this in children using some working memory tasks. This is very early data, but I want to share it with you. So we knew that working memory was being challenged in children with hearing loss who use 1 implant. Question is it because of the frequency problems that are there with an implant, or is it because of bilateral hearing? So we decided, let's look at this task where we were presenting a series of numbers to children, and they had to repeat the numbers back. And what I'm showing you is the numbers of digits so the amount of digits series that they could repeat back. Is it a short amount or long in terms of the span of digits? We're looking at this in children who have single-sided deafness, 1 normal hearing ear, and comparing them to children who have bilateral deafness, but they got 2 cochlear implants at the same time. So they don't have perfect binaural hearing, spatial hearing, but they have some, and that's better than single-sided deafness. And how do these 2 groups compare on this task to normal hearing children? And the answer is, that's starting to emerge, fascinating, is that all groups, of course, get better and better with age as a developmental improvement in working memory on this task, as shown by this task. The children with single-sided deafness, 1 normal hearing ear, show the worst performance relative to the other groups. So there's still some deficits in children with bilateral devices, but they're doing better than children listening unilaterally. That is fascinating to me. So the question is, well, this is a language task. Does it translate to anything else? And we looked at a spatial task, just the idea that maybe children with unilateral hearing have troubles with space, remembering where things are in space, and indeed that was true. So here we're moving dots around a grid and asking children to tell us the positions of those and how many positions could they remember, and tell them to us backward. And again, you can see the deficits in children with single-sided hearing. Now, those deficits are not significant at early ages. They may be there, but we don't see it yet on this test, which tells you about the importance of understanding what is the test you're actually doing. When you start to see it is into adolescence. So those deficits were probably there in early life, but on this task, you really see the emergence of the problem into adolescence. And so what I'm telling you is that unilateral hearing is really hard, and it has consequences for working memory, and that we can alleviate this to some extent by giving hearing in both ears, even though it's not perfect hearing both ears. Okay, now let's talk about bilateral hearing If you're going to do it, let's do it the best way we can. And the most obvious factor to avoid is a delay. So timing is key. We know we have to intervene early during important periods of development. So let's not wait until those important periods are almost done. Let's get these devices in as early as possible. I'm going to explain to you why I think that that's true. One of the problems we first encountered was when we gave children two devices, and actually this was not just in children. This was a conversation that I had with one of our audiologists, and she has asymmetric hearing. And she told me, "Can you just talk to my better hearing ear?" And I said to her, "I don't know what you're talking about. How do you know which ear is a better hearing ear?" And she said, "Well, obviously I hear you in this ear." And it struck me that normal hearing people, we don't know which ear we're listening to one voice in one place in space, because our auditory system is so good at integrating the two different inputs to our left ear and our right ear that we hear one fused sound. And so if somebody says to you, "Talk to my better ear," that tells you already that there is a problem with that integration between the two ears. And if there's a better ear, one ear is carrying more of the load for hearing than the other. And what I'm going to show you is that asymmetry, that preference for hearing with one ear, comes when we delay access to bilateral sound during early development, or when we mismatch the input from both sides. So let's look back at what are we trying to do with two implants. Again, we're not treating the ears with devices. What we're trying to do is stimulate the pathways from each ear all the way from the auditory nerve on each side to integrate as it normally would in the brainstem, and then to be projected up to the cortex. And I want you to remember again that the pathways from each ear do cross mainly contralaterally. Okay. So how are we going to measure activity from each cortex, or from each pathway, the left and the right? Well, we're going to use some electrophysiologic measures. And we've done this looking at responses from each ear in the brainstem, but today I want to just concentrate on activity in the left and right auditory cortex. How do we measure that? Well, we put electrodes over the surface of the head, many different positions in children. We use a cap, so they can't pull it off, and they're always in the right position. And they're always smiling when we do this, not necessarily. We present very simple stimuli through their devices, direct connect to their devices, or with acoustic hearing, we put trains of clicks into their ears, and we get a response through all of those recording channels. And you can see that there's a very early response here, around 100 milliseconds. And that has a distribution over the surface of the head. Some of the electrodes are picking up a positive amplitude, and some of them are picking up a negative amplitude. And this distribution over the head is what we use to then try to determine what parts of the brain are contributing to that surface response. So we divide the brain into very tiny spaces, 64,000 spaces we divide the brain into. And these are called voxels. So we assess the amount of activity that is in each voxel that would contribute to this distribution over the surface of the head for that child. And so what you can see in this example is that in response to sound, not surprising, the biggest signals are in the left and the right auditory brain. So now we've actually measured those two different responses, and we can ask two different questions. First, we can ask, if we give a sound in one ear or the other ear, which brain, the left or the right, is responding more? So this is cortical hemispheric lateralization. So we would always expect, as you see here, that it's the contralateral cortex that's responding more. So you can see to the left stimulation, you get more activity in the right, and the same thing. Right stimulation, you get more activity in the left. Now, we also learned of another beautiful measure from Andre Kroll, who was working with deaf white cats. So here, we can look at one brain, the right or the left, and we can ask, wait a minute, which ear is stimulating this brain more, the left ear or the right ear? So if we just look at the right brain for right now, let's ask ourselves, what would normally stimulate this brain? Well, it should be the left ear more than the right, because the left ear is the contralateral ear. And indeed, in 2 different studies, we found that that was true. In this brain, the contralateral left ear was the preferred ear here. Perfect. Now, what happens in a child who has been using a right cochlear implant for a long time in this part of the brain? Well, we had a hypothesis that this brain would start responding more to this device. There would be strengthening of the ipsilateral pathways and weakening of the pathways coming from the other side, because there's no input there. There's nothing to drive those pathways in very important stages of development. And that is exactly what we found. Once we gave 2 cochlear implants, we could measure this. Which ear is the one providing the most stimulation? You can see here, these are children who received 2 cochlear implants simultaneously, and look how normal the responses are. There is activity that is contralateral, so this left implant is stimulating the right brain as expected more. But with time, this switches to an ipsilateral. So we were right. There is an increased strengthening of this ear because we left it hearing alone, and we allowed these pathways to be deprived. The important thing I want you to note here is that these children, these effects happened before we gave them 2 cochlear implants. And we had allowed them to listen with these 2 cochlear implants for 3 to 4 years. So whatever had changed during the period of unilateral hearing had not reversed. We had not corrected for this problem, even though they had worn these 2 devices for so long. And that's the problem that we have in early development, that if we miss important times, we may not be able to reverse the changes that occur. So we predicted that this meant an oral preference was being established because of reorganization in the auditory system for the first hearing ear that was not being reversed with 2 cochlear implants. And most recently, after looking at 400 children with bilateral devices, we realized that that is true. So we confirmed that when you give 2 cochlear implants with a delay between the 2, what you have are children with their first device with speech perception in very easy situations who are doing very well with the first device, over 50%. RAW is a kind of a percent, okay? Look at the degree of activity or the performance from the newly implanted device or the second device. It ranges from very poor all the way up to very good. This line here is where the ears are symmetric. There's the same performance between the 2 sides. You can see some children do achieve that, but many do not. The data are below that unity line, indicating poor performance in the second implanted ear, even after many years I want you to remember here is that if we promote oral preference in early development, and we cannot, and that remains after bilateral implant use because we just waited too long, the benefits of using those two devices will also decrease. Let's talk about spatial hearing. Back to what I started with, which was this complex listening environment. Speech perception measures don't tell us much about how the children are using their hearing in these complex listening situations, and our hope is that we are promoting some degree of spatial hearing for these children so that they can succeed here. So we have a few different tests for looking at spatial hearing, but this one is the easiest, even for young children to perform. So what we do is we present speech in noise coming from the same place, speakers from the front. And then we just create some spatial distance between the noise and the speech. Okay? So we move the noise either to the left or to the right. And we're asking children to detect the sound, tell us when you hear it, and we're measuring the thresholds to that sound. So we expect that their thresholds, the signal to noise, will actually be better in this situation because of the access to spatial hearing than when they're co-located. And indeed, that's what happens. So here are their thresholds in blue when sounds and noise are coming from the same place, no spatial information. And all of these children, the bilateral cochlear implant users, the bimodal users, do show a benefit of having spatial separation between the sound, the speech sound that they're trying to listen to, and the noise. So that's amazing. Having bilateral devices helps listen in noise when there's spatial separation. But I just want you to notice a couple things. Look at this. In these two groups, children receiving two cochlear implants sequentially or the bimodal users, look at the difference. There's better advantage when the noise is moved to the worse ear. And this was highly significant, meaning that these children are showing, even in this task, effects of their oral preference. You move the noise to their preferred ear, they don't like it so much. They're getting help from the other device, from their spatial hearing, but it's not as good because they have a preference for that ear relative to when you move the noise to the other side. Okay, so this all culminated in a paper that we published in Pediatrics, a state-of-the-art review where we said, listen, if you allow auditory development in the bilateral pathways from each ear to be asymmetric in time, you're going to get pathways which are stronger from the first hearing ear relative to those from the second. And that's going to cause asymmetries in speech perception, which I've just shown you. And finally, that will have some compromising effects on binaural spatial hearing. And I've shown you all of those things. So what do? Just provide access to sound in both ears. Use whatever device is most appropriate. You heard that this morning. Okay, I'm going to finish with the last point, and that is we have not got this figured out yet. And we know this through a number of different measures. One is we've looked at how the brain responds to sounds coming from each ear, and we find clear deficits, even in children who receive two cochlear implants at the same time, in cortical detection of these important binaural cues, interaural level differences, interaural timing differences. So that's a bit of a problem. That could be because these children were still deaf for some period of time, and maybe we actually need to try to provide these devices earlier than we are. And there are also effects on perception, and we measure this in two ways. One is we take the sounds, we move them around children's heads by changing the intraoral level or the intraoral timing, and we ask them, where do you hear the sound? Is it on the left or is it on the right? And we see clear deficits, particularly to perception of intraoral timing cues when we do this. So it's really hard also for children with cochlear implants to hear differences in timing. So we blamed the cochlear implant. And recently, we've looked at this in children using 2 hearing aids. And we find that the perception of intraoral timing cues on this task is still in deficit in children who use 2 hearing aids. So it's not completely particular to bilateral implants. The second test that we do is we ask about binaural fusion. Do you actually hear one sound when you're listening with both devices in? And the answer is they don't, not consistently with 2 cochlear implants. This is better in children who use 2 hearing aids. So this may have to do with persistent mismatches in the input that we give to these children. So what are these mismatches that would create or maintain asymmetries between the 2 ears? It may have to do with the deafness itself, but we are not avoiding the problems of deafness in integrating between the 2 ears because of the following. We program hearing aids and cochlear implants in each ear, and we don't wonder what happens to that sound when they put both devices on. And that's probably an issue because specific to cochlear implants, we could have mismatches in the place of stimulation between the 2 ears. Imagine 2 devices that are different or maybe in slightly different places in each cochlea in the same child. We think we're stimulating the same apical electrode when we pair 2 electrodes in the same position along the implanted array, but they may not actually be matched in terms of the cochlear place of stimulation. And so imagine that you are listening to 2 different pitches between the 2 ears. We know from normal hearing children that actually creates a problem in this integration between the 2 ears. You hear sounds as 2 different sounds coming from each ear. And that also causes problems with hearing binaural information. What about level? Just because we fit to targets in each ear, or we make sounds audible and comfortable through a cochlear implant in each ear, doesn't mean that we've actually created balanced or accurate access to intraoral level cues from soft sounds to loud sounds. So that's a problem. And again, that could compromise their ability to hear spatially using those cues. And finally, the timing between the 2 devices is probably off. Each of these devices works completely independently. So we know we are disrupting the timing of intraoral timing cues just because of the processing between 2 independent devices, cochlear implants or hearing aids. And that becomes really a problem in bimodal users. So I'm going to let our next speaker talk a little bit more about how we might correct for those. And so I promised you this would be my take-home message. The first slide is the last slide. And I hope what I've convinced you is that children using 1 cochlear implant are they're gaining speech and language. This is great, but they are putting in a huge amount of effort. And that is probably because they don't listen in a sound booth all the time. They listen out in the real world, and it's hard. And it gets harder as they get older, in older ages, and they might remove themselves from that situation. If we give them 2 devices, it helps. It's not perfect, but it definitely helps. Their listening challenges seem to reduce. You can even see it in the sound booth when they're listening with 2 devices. They just relax a little bit more, and their responses are quicker. If we're going to promote bilateral hearing in order to get the best benefit of giving 2 devices, promoting bilateral hearing, just do it as soon as you can in early development and don't delay one to the next. If we do that, we will have established strong pathways from both ears, and then we can work on promoting better binaural hearing. We can work on those problems in mismatched place, timing, and level so that we give those strong pathways from each ear access to accurate and consistent binaural cues so they really can develop the spatial hearing they need to listen in complex situations like the playground. So thank you so much for listening with the interpreter. Thank you to the interpreter for helping me carry this message across and for welcoming me here to be with you at Madrid.